afternoon. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to what you will find to be a fascinating discussion of a new book that has just come out with its author. And we're going to be talking about history, we're going to be talking about world wars, about global conflicts, and don't be surprised if we also don't spend some time talking about current conflicts, particularly the war in Ukraine, because as you'll find out, this book and its author has many insights into what's happening there and the lessons of history and what they provide us for the view of what's happening now and also what's coming. Attila Szalai-Berezivitsy is a noted Hungarian economist and a banking and capital markets executive with over 30 years' experience in Austria and Central Eastern Europe. Between 2004 and 2008, he served as president of the Budapest Stock Exchange and is a proud recipient of the Knight's Cross Order of the Republic of Hungary, awarded to him in recognition of his contribution to the development of the Hungarian securities market and pension system. We should also note that as a former pentathlete and fencer, he is the chairman of the board of BOM Hungarian Sports Foundation. Now, since 2012, as a professional photographer and an amateur historian, he and his company, Historical Military Photos, have been producing First and Second World War-related photographic images for, among others, the French company The Beaches of Normandy Tours. And in 2014, on the eve of the centenary of the start of the Great War, he began to work on this book. This is an amazing work, I have to tell you. And when I first got a chance to glance through it and to see the beautiful photographs and the very moving and informative captions that went with it, I realized this must have been in many ways a great labor of love for you, particularly because of the amount of time that you spent working on it and traveling everywhere. If I can frame it for our audience, for those who haven't read the book yet, basically what you've done is to tour virtually every battlefield, major and minor, of the Great War, and not just the usual suspects like Verdun and Passchendaele and the Somme and the usual battles we think about with the Western Front, but also the battlefields of the Eastern Front, the battlefields in Turkey during the Gallipoli campaign, but even battlefields as far away as Southwest Africa, as what was then Mesopotamia, and the campaigns in the Middle East. It's just an extraordinary trip. So tell us about that, how you got started, and about your extremely distinguished traveling companion as part of the journey.
Well, thank you very much for the interest and for this discussion today. The journey started in 2014. It started out as a much smaller scale project. Oh. I was preparing some photography work for an exhibition for the Centennial of the start of the First World War. And then came the idea that perhaps this could make a book. And later, at that time, it was still so to be a smaller book for 2016. So we thought it would be ready by then. But from 2014, during the Christmas truce, I was suddenly realizing that the whole Centennial program in Europe will be much, much larger scale than I anticipated. And it is very photographic. And you have reenactors, you have statesmen, you have history enthusiasts. So there was a huge interest. And then I realized that maybe we should record this and photograph all the way till Armistice Day in 2018. And that created the project, a big one.
A big one. And this is just really the first volume that only takes us up through to the end of 1915.
Yes.
And so you've got 1916, 1917, 1918 to come out with at least one more volume, I think.
Yeah. a second volume will be covering,
covering it.
those years when the armies were wearing already helmets.
Yes,
So that's how
really the
we cut
watershed,
into
yes.
2 parts, because 14, 15, still armies were preparing for a very different war.
Right. And as far as the Western Front, what we usually think about when we think about World War I as a Western European conflict between the British, French, and the Germans, and then eventually the Americans. The real fighting, the real slaughter hadn't really gotten underway in the scale. But now it's easy to forget that in the eastern part of the war, the eastern theater, that the war was really fully engaged almost from the moment that the countries mobilized and the war began. And that includes
Yeah.
the engagement of your countrymen, of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Russia, Serbia, as well as Germany, and the events and the conflicts that unfolded about that I don't think a lot of American audiences, unless they have relatives or family connections, really realize how huge and how important that conflict really was.
Most people think the First World War started on 4th of August when Germany invaded Belgium. But in fact, the start of the war dates back to 28th of July, 1914, when the Austro-Hungarian army attacked Belgrade. It was a smaller skirmish, probably that's the best word, to river monitors was pounding or shelling Belgrade, and it was already an action, but relatively small one. And at that time, people still didn't think that this will end up in World War I.
And I didn't realize, I'm sorry to interrupt, I didn't realize until I opened your book that one of those monitors still survives.
Yeah.
And is in fact has been restored and is now an historic monument.
The Serbs obviously kept it. And they restored it just a few years ago. They started to restore it a few years ago, and it became ready by 1st of November 2021. So it's this is the first book that has that monitor in it. So yeah.
Now, over the next several months and into 1917, massive armies would be mobilized in the East, right?
Yeah.
As Austria-Hungary and Germany now became fully engaged with Russia in the conflict and the great battles, which you talk about and have very moving photographs of the battlefields, but also of the graveyards of those who fell in those battles. That this was just really it was the opening of a war that would become much wider over the next several years as Bulgaria, as Romania also became participants in the conflict and as the war unfolded. And from that standpoint, I think it's important to realize, my view, that it's the war in the East during World War I that's really the watershed event in the shaping of the history of modern Europe. That in the end, the combatants in the Western Front, in the Western theater, France, Great Britain, Germany, United States, their boundaries didn't change. Their national boundaries, their national characters really didn't alter very much, Germany somewhat. But in the East, empires disappeared, new nations sprang up, and a whole new destiny for tens of millions of people opened up as a result of the conflict that was unleashed by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, his son, in Sarajevo in June.
Letting alone from Alsace-Lorraine, which was the debated territory between France and Germany. That was the major border change. That's on the west. On the east, yes, you had those territories, those nations, which belonged to the Russian Empire, the German, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So the Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe was always divided by these big empires. And, and the whole war started out with the belief that monarchies and these empires and the colonial empires will be strengthened by the end of the war, and they will live on. And nobody expected that, in fact, not one single nation will be achieving any of its goal that was set before the start of the war. Especially nobody expected that all of the empires will be dissembling and falling apart. It started with the Russian Empire and ended with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And on the ashes of these empires, completely new states were created, or nations reborn who used to be sovereign nations centuries earlier, like the Poles, but lost their sovereignty to the Russian Empire. So yes, it went through big changes, very similar to the Middle East.
Very similar. And did that give the centennial of the war a different kind of flavor, a different kind of importance than it may have had for those in the West, or certainly for the United States? You know, it's important to realize when I look out at all these youngsters sitting there in their chairs, they didn't know what it was like to grow up when veterans of World War I were all around you. I mean, it was part of life,
Yeah.
was men who had served either in men I knew, older men that I knew, both British and American, for whom service in World War I was part of their was part of their resume, as it were. In fact, when I was growing up, my father was studying at Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The gentleman who lived just on the other side of our fence, in the backyard, had been in the AEF in France and gave me the German cuirassier's helmet that he had brought home as a souvenir, which I still have, as a matter of fact. But that was kind of part of your world. But when the Centennial came, I think certainly for Americans, it was an interesting date in which to notice. And certainly for the French and the British, it was important because of the enormous human losses that the war had brought. But for those who had been part of and whose lives were and were affected by what happened in the East, did it give a different kind of thrust to the way in which people thought about the Centennial?
The Centennial passed on the former Eastern Front almost unnoticed.
No kidding.
Yeah. Few, mostly in Serbia or Romania, but letting alone from these two countries, there were no winners, in fact, in the Great War. Everyone was, in a way, either part of the losing camp, or the most they could achieve is having an independent country after 1918. But the real military victory was not achieved by anybody, because you must not forget that on the Eastern Front, the war was in fact won by the Central Powers. Right. They pushed Russia out of the war with the help of the Bolsheviks. So the only allied or Entente nation, the Russian Empire, lost the war before the war was ended. And those who won it, they became the losers of the Great War. And because nobody felt the Great War as its own war.
That's very
its attitude towards the Centennial was very different. And there's one more very important factor that concerns the Eastern Front, and that is the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union took over this part of the world after the Second World War. And for the Soviets, for Stalin, the Great War was a bad war. The great patriotic war of the Second World War was the good war.
That's a good one.
And for them, remembering the First World War, remembering a Tsarist war, was not part of their agenda. What's more, it was forbidden. And therefore, if you go to Belarus today, or Ukraine, or Lithuania, you don't see their First World War military cemeteries, not even Russian ones.
Not even
A few you can
memorials to the
find, but
killed.
very, very neglected or totally destroyed. There's no monuments, memorials whatsoever. So in 2014, it was a big thing that in Moscow, President Putin unveiled a Great War memorial. That was actually the first recognition of Russia's involvement in the First World War. So you see only major monuments or memorials only in Romania and Serbia. Regarding state-ran commemorations between 2014 and 18, there wasn't really.
Very interesting.
The Polish, the most of the battles took place in today's Poland, the territories of Poland. Right. The Polish were divided between three armies. So Polish people were fighting in the Russian army, in the Austro-Hungarian army, in the German army equally. So this is this wasn't the war of the Polish or the Polish state.
No. And in fact, as I talk about in my book, the 1917, the Germans even tried to present that as an incentive to get Poles to join the German army against the Russians. And that is that if you fight for the side of the Germany, we'll establish Polish independence. Yeah. And the German generals thought that they would bring hundreds of thousands of Polish volunteers to sort of bolster their manpower, and it didn't work. The Poles weren't fooled by that. They knew that this was going to have to be a fight that they would have to take on themselves and not through someone else. It's also interesting, too, that among the prizes that Germany won, temporarily, a result of its victory over Tsarist Russia, was Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And it's important to realize, too, that Ukraine also is part of that great battleground that's been occupying the struggle between nations and empires for thousands of years, really, but also is an important part of modern history as well. What about that from the point of view of memory of World War I for Ukraine and Ukrainians? Did it have any kind of impact when you were doing your tour there?
I've been to Ukraine because the 1916 battle or offensive of the Russians, the Brusilov offensive, was taking place in their current territories. Plus, they have Lviv. We know it very well today from the news. It's still not part of the military actions, but it's right next to the front line today, just like in 1914. Yeah. When the Russians were attacking from the east, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then one of their first achievements was to take Lviv, which was at that time called Lemberg. And that was, again, something big at that time, but nobody is really in the position to commemorate today because at that time it was Austria-Hungary's city, right. The most important, most eastern city of the empire. There's no Austro-Hungarian Empire. This territory is now in Ukraine. And at that time, the Russians were taking it, which are certainly not celebrated in Ukraine.
These days.
So the battles around Galicia and Lemberg belongs to nobody today.
That's right. Which is, as an historian, to say that's so sad. And yet, one can also understand why. If you see yourselves as having been the perpetual losers, whoever wins, Ukrainians are going to be the losers. It makes it hard to sort of think about raising a glass or raising a celebration for that. Now let's talk a little bit about your trip and about, number one, what inspired you to go so far afield, to really travel the globe in order to do this? And where did you find, what was the reception like in places like Africa, for example, when you went to visit long forgotten battlefields, at least for those of us who know the World War I?
The whole book project started when Russia invaded Crimea. That created for me
No kidding.
a new situation, because me as an economist, I was under the strong conviction that we will not see a war anymore in Europe.
You weren't alone.
Simply because globalization means that even the winner of a potential war will lose more than it can actually gain out of it. So I think while today we tend to challenge the results of the globalization, and we tend to label it as a bad thing, or at least with lots of negativities, I must say as an economist that globalization contributes to world peace big time because of the interest. And when globalization is falling apart, or we are stepping back from it because of the COVID pandemic, then it means that nations are turning towards themselves. And then and when countries try to produce everything for themselves, so globalization is disappearing, then there's a chance for a war. But anyway, in 2014, we were still far away from the pandemic, and we were under the impression that world peace will last forever.
Right.
And then this attack happened, and I realized that war actually can happen still in Europe, in the world, between major powers. And besides that, there was another very dangerous phenomenon, and this was the rise of the Islamic State in 2014. So I was at that time quite worried that maybe history is repeating itself 100 years later, and that really made me more interested and more conscious about the start of the Centennial of the First World War, which started in Sarajevo on 28th June 2014. So I thought that now there's a reason to talk about the Great War. And moreover, because I thought that there are things that are very similar between today and the story of 1914. And this is how I got inspired to do this book, because I thought that in the past 200 years, the most important period of humankind's history is 1914, 1918, because that changed so dramatically the world, and still people tend to forget about it. Obviously, the First World War was overshadowed by the Second World War. And even here in America, people know much less about the First World War than the Second World War. Also, the Great War made America the superpower of the world, not the Second World War. So it would deserve much, much more attention just because of the outcome of the war. But because of its causes and because of its how it started, because it didn't start it from one day to another. It didn't start it just by Gavrilo Princip assassinating Franz Ferdinand. There was a run-up, many decades. So it deserves much more attention in 2022 than it gets.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. And that's one of the reasons why the subtitle for the book that I did on 1917 was The Birth of the New World Disorder.
Yeah.
Because it became more and more difficult to establish some sort of stable global order, even as economically interconnectivity meant more and more countries drawn into a single or a holistic global system. And I guess we have to distinguish, don't we, between globalization, which is a physical and economic as well as social process, and globalism, which is an ideology which I think in many ways took for granted the fact that globalization would simply be unfold inevitably through the future, and that therefore conflicts would simply disappear. Forgetting that from time to time, people will buck the trend. And we saw that with Putin in 2014 with Crimea, which he got away with.
Yes.
And so it's not surprising that he figured I might as well try it again because it was no one really called me on it in 2014, so I might as well try it again. Try it again this time with an even bigger prize at stake. Now I'm going to ask you this question about the trip that you took, the many places that you went. What was the one battlefield or the one place that you visited that surprised you the most? The one, or the experience, I should say, that really was one you said, my God, this is really worth it for me personally, as well as for the themes of the book.
For me, definitely the most exciting were the most difficult trips.
I'll bet.
Getting into Iraq and Syria and the Gaza Strip.
Okay.
These were dangerous, obviously. I had to give up my ESTA status to the United States, because once I enter these countries, I will be I will have to take visa for the rest of my life. But I realized that this book is important, and telling the story of the First World War without these three countries is far from complete, because they had. They tend to look at as a sideshow, but they were very important already at that time. But if we are looking back to the creation of the Middle East, it is very, very, very important today. So obviously, at that time when I traveled there, the Islamic State was still present in Iraq and Syria, and they were just left Mosul. And I had to go to Mosul.
You did?
Because that's where the Mesopotamian campaign ended in 1918. So the British landed in the Fao Peninsula. They took Basra, and then they worked their way all the way along the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers to Nasiriyah and Baghdad, and then they continued their campaign from Baghdad to Mosul. On the other hand, the British and the Arab Revolt was pushing the Ottoman Empire from the current Saudi Arabian territories, from Mecca, Medina, through current Jordan and current Israel, all the way to current Syria. And Syria was the big prize that the Arab Revolt was hoping to get and achieve.
And all these are photographs you took?
Yeah.
Are we able to get a camera focus on this, or is that not, can't we do it? From the Middle East and Africa and the Falkland Islands as well, to go commemorate the Battle of Coronel and the clash between the German and British fleets out in the middle of the South Atlantic. When you went to these places, did people did they sort of say, what are you doing here? Really? There was a war here? We didn't even know. We had no clue about that.
That is true for the African countries and the Middle East and many of the countries outside Europe. But the Falkland Islands is different because they had two major historic events taking place there, so they remember both of them, the 1914 and later when the British fought with the Argentinians.
There was something, that sort of came with all that.
So they have the Battle Day. They commemorate it every year in December with the British Army that is stationed on the islands. So they take it very seriously. So generally, I can say that all the Anglo-Saxon countries are very serious about the commemorations of the First World War. All of them are part of the winning allies, so there's no surprise about it. But some of them, like the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders, are dating back the birth of their nation and their independent states to the First World War and to the achievements that they performed there. The Canadians, especially at the Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, the Australians and the New Zealanders in Gallipoli.
In Gallipoli, which you talk about in the first volume, and then Vimy Ridge will come up in the discussion
Yes.
in your second version, second volume as well. The other question that I've got for you is looking at this now, and it's really I'm really struck by the fact that it was the invasion of Crimea that got you started on this. Now we're engaged in a terrible war in Ukraine, on your country's doorstep here. Looking now at what's unfolding and what's taking place, what kind of key lessons does this book and does the experience of World War I provide for us for what is happening now? Besides, don't make this mistake again.
The Russians should have learned from the lessons of the First World War. Because what I see is that since the French Revolution, as the words started to turn into democracies led by parliaments and governments, some of the armies started to be under civil control, under the control of the government, and some remained under warlords, kings, emperors. And if you look at the First World War, all of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, they were all having armies controlled by the supreme leader. Either it's the king, the emperor, or generals. And there was no civil oversight over the armies. And those who won the First World War are all countries where the parliament was controlling the army and the generals. There was only one exception, that was Russia. But that was the only country within the Allies which lost the First World War. And that was also a non-democratic state where the Tsar was personally leading the Russian forces. So what does that mean? My observation and my assessment after the First World War is that armies led by democratic countries are more efficient. They make less mistake. Why? Because there the generals are reporting to politicians who must be winning elections every 4 years. And life matters there. In countries where the armies are led by one person who is not measured every 4 years in a general election, tend to make mistakes because there's no checks and balances over the decision-making process on political level and on military level. And if we look at all the wars after First World War, you see that the aggressions are always committed by countries which are non-democratic. And the wars are always won by countries where democracy prevails. So if we take this pattern into consideration, then I can say that Russia made a big mistake under the current circumstances to go into a war because they can't win it. And we don't know how it will play out, but certainly countries without civil oversight are less successful in maintaining their army in order and on a victorious path.
Do you think that plays any part in the way in which the war is unfolding now?
Well,
where it was seen as being a totally David and Goliath struggle, and the assumption was that the Russians would win in a matter of days, if not weeks, including myself, when I was thinking about when the war started, how long this would take place. And yet what we see is precisely that same pattern being played out there.
Aggression committed by undemocratic countries are always starting with a mistake, that they overestimate their own powers and underestimate the enemy. And what could have been learned from the First World War is that a country, no matter how small it is, but defending its homeland is always 2, 3, 4 times more stronger than its real potential justifies. Think about Serbia against Austria-Hungary. Think about Belgium against Germany. They were all deciding the war, basically because the Belgians were so efficient in defending their countries. They killed the Schlieffen Plan. What was the goal of the Germans? They stopped Germany to execute this plan and take Paris so that they can concentrate all their forces on the Eastern Front against Russia. Same, Austria-Hungary made a mistake. They thought it will be a blitzkrieg against Serbia and the war will be over by the time the big powers would intervene. And I see, and obviously it's very visible to everyone, is that Russia made a number of miscalculations about Ukraine. And probably this has a lot to do that there's no checks and balances in the decision making. So probably there was nobody who could tell that the Russian army is unprepared, partly because the supply lines and all the reinforcements of the Russian army is not that great as anyone was anticipating before that. Nobody told to the leadership that wars are not fought anymore like in the Second World War, where you have huge tank thrusts and advances followed by infantry. But today there are javelins who take out the tanks, and suddenly infantry is defending the tanks instead of tanks defending the infantry. So a lot of things are now has changed since the last war, and seemingly Russia was unprepared for this.
Yep, and I think they were also unprepared for the degree to which the contest for control of the skies over Ukraine, in terms of unmanned aircraft and so on, that also severely hampers the way in which the Russians have been able to conduct this campaign. My last question for you is twofold, and then we'll open it up to our audience for questions. Two other things which I think have emerged from this current conflict in Ukraine, which I think has some reflection on all this too. The first one is people have pointed out that suddenly NATO as an alliance suddenly has this powerful raison d'etre again, that it's not just simply a, what should I say, a security blanket in case something happens, you know, with Russia, but it's happening now, and suddenly the value of NATO and of membership in NATO has taken on a whole new meaning for those countries who've been bordering on this conflict as well as others. The second thing I think that this war has highlighted, and others have pointed out, is the degree to which this has been a struggle for Ukrainians about their country and about sovereignty and about the need for a nation which is, in a sense, expressive of a community of shared culture, of shared values, and that nation state is something worth dying for and worth sacrificing for, at a time when for the last couple of decades we've seen the globalism ideology being one saying that people will lose more and more their sense of loyalty or connection or belonging to the nation state. Ukrainians seem to be demonstrating just the opposite of a passionate commitment to that in ways that I think have surprised the Russians, but I think has also surprised just about everybody else.
Yeah, I think this war is reinventing NATO and reinventing nation state. Both is very important and must be part of our life, even if many started to less appreciate these days, mostly because they took peace for granted and they took globalization for granted. Yeah. And NATO will not be an aggressive military alliance ever, by nature. Why? Because people in the member states would never allow their armies to go and conquer other states.
think
These are democratic countries.
I think there's another reason too, we mustn't forget, and that is NATO represents a diversity of national interests
Yes.
rather than a single unified interest, apart from stopping Russian aggression.
Absolutely. And on the other hand, there's nothing better marketing machine for NATO than Russia. My country voluntarily joined NATO. Nobody forced us to be a member of NATO. We went into NATO because we had our historic track record with the Soviet Union, with Russia, and we felt that it makes Hungary safer by joining a winning military alliance system. And obviously, the same consideration was true for Poland, the Baltic states, and so on. But this doesn't mean that NATO would ever mean threat to any sovereign nations, not to mention Russia or anyone else.
Yeah.
Your second point, yes, Ukraine is fighting as a nation state, and it is very important. In peacetime, we don't value that much a nation state, but you can see what happens with Ukraine. They can only count on themselves. So when your country is attacked, and we had the same experience, Hungarians, in 1956. Everyone felt sorry about Hungary. Everyone was looking at the Hungarian revolution as something, a great event, a hope. But nobody helped us.
Nope.
And the same true for Ukraine, because nobody wants to go into a third world war. So this means that when there's a trouble, you can count on your own people, nobody else. If you don't defend your country, nobody else will.
It's a key lesson in all of this, isn't it? Should we have some questions from the audience? Questions that come up? If you can just identify yourself as part of the discussion.
John Fonte, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. I'm thinking of a book called The Grand Illusion, 1911, Norman Ansel, which was sort of proto-globalization, I guess. He predicted in 1911. He said there'll never be another European war because particularly Great Britain and Germany are so intertwined, German students going to Oxford and Cambridge, British students in Heidelberg, and the commercial relationship between these countries is very strong. He wrote this in 1911. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, sort of what you said earlier about globalization in the 90s wouldn't lead to another European conflict, but was the Grand Illusion in your book, or do you have any thoughts on that?
The Grand Illusion relates to
this book of 1911.
Norman Angel's book, yeah.
That was a bestseller, I think, at the time, and by a Brit, Norman Ansel wrote the book, and I think it was widely discussed. And he just said there's not going to ever be a war. And of course, 3 years later was 1914. So I don't know if that was part of your. It parallels what you were saying earlier about what happened in the late 20th century.
I think on 24th February 2022. We can say that we had a grand illusion again, just like in 1914. Because in 1914, at the summer of that year, everyone thought that the world will not need another Napoleonic war because we have decades of growth, prosperity, civilization progressed big time. Europe was never so beautiful before and rich. Why would we ever go to war? What they forgot about is that the industrialization changed the world again because it took the European states into a new renaissance of colonization. And the colonization meant race for energy and minerals and raw materials that the European industry needed. And the First World War, in fact, erupted because of colonial race. The German Empire wanted more place under the sun. It was only possible at the expense of the British Empire, the French, Um, and, uh, and that changed the landscape. And eventually we ended up in a war. Now, after the Second World War, for 70 years, we thought there was the other grand illusion that, that peace is granted. What I observed is that 100 years passed between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, and pretty much 100 years passed between the Second World War and the days we are in today. This is how much time you need to lose all those generations who directly or indirectly experienced the war, a great European war. So those breaks in the system, in the decision-making system, those generations, when they go out, then people of the new the new generations who take peace for granted because they have never experienced a war before, they tend to take war as an option more easier than those who already experienced war before. So in this way, we are not only in times when the pandemic is pushing back globalization and the countries are trying to go back in history regarding their economies, but also we are at those days when the last people who saw the Second World War fought in it, they are 100-year-old. And we are basically in the time when we have no First World War, no Second World War veterans at all.
No one to say, take it easy. Yeah. There, and then we'll come back here.
Mr. Saleh, Principinti, I'm Timothy Walt. I'm a fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Congratulations on your momentous work. My question has to do with another type of battlefield. I think your book focuses mostly on the physical battlefields around the world, touring them, but drawing on your experience in the financial and economic sectors, what can you talk about some of the economic battles or financial battles of the First World War, and do you draw any lessons from the current confrontation, war taking place in Ukraine and the sanctions that are being imposed?
It's a good question. The first sanctions in history were introduced, in fact, in the First World War, when Britain drew up its Royal Navy in the North Sea and in the English Channel and blockaded Germany. They wanted to stifle the German economy by not letting any export material from the United States or from other places of the world to reach Germany. And that was a early first kind of sanction. And then the Germans introduced the all-out submarine warfare in return. That was another economic sanction, try to sink all the ships that was heading to the British islands. The British blockade worked better. Now in the Second World War, obviously we saw that the German reserves were confiscated in the banks in America. Only safe haven they had was Switzerland. So for me, I would spend less time on the Second World War, but what is now very important is the war in Ukraine, because now we are testing something that we have never done before. This is the first time when we have a sixth front line in a war. The first three was always there: the air, the sea, the land. Then the fourth came with the space when Reagan's Star Wars project was launched. Then the cyber space is the fifth, and now the financial system is the sixth front line in a war. So you have to fight in all six front lines in modern warfare. And this is the first time when the Western nations lined up so unanimously and closed all channels of the financial world towards Russia. Obviously, there's a debate out there whether this is counterproductive. We hurt ourselves more than we hurt the Russians. I look at this in a different way. It's not for me, it's not the question what is that measure which is hurting us less. For me, what is important, what is that measure that is really stopping Russia to continue this war? So at this moment of time, we are unable to tell by a high certainty that this was enough or this was too much, or what we should use next time we are in a similar situation and what we can forget about. But definitely, the amount of sanctions that Russia is getting these days is unprecedented historically, and the expectation is that they will be forced to give up this war because simply the financing of the war will be impossible. The bad news, if this is not working, then there's nothing else left for us but going back to the battlefields and decide any conflicts on the battlefield. And that wouldn't be good for any of the nations.
So let's hope it works.
Yeah, let's hope it works.
We have time for one more question.
My name is Monica Palotai, and I'm a visiting research fellow at Hudson. And my question would be partially taken by Tim. But anyhow, I go with the second question. Do you think, I mean, based on all those what you just said, do you think we're living in a moment, another moment of grand illusion?
Well, as we discussed, I think we passed that point. So the fact that Russia is in war with Ukraine, it is proving to us that war is possible. And just like in 1914, again, economic rationality is not preventing war to happen. So we have to, it will take us back to new renaissance of arms race and military alliances. So the fact that the life we had in the past 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, that was a grace period, which in my view will not return. So we will have a new and probably very strong Cold War in the decades that ahead of us.
And not just with Russia, but also there's another power, the issue of China. And my hope is that one of the things that will happen with your book is that it gets translated into Chinese. I think there's a lot of powerful lessons for both for leaders and peoples about what happens when a dictatorship goes to war.
Yeah.
What happens to their people. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you,
for
for joining
much.
us.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for joining us for our wonderful discussion. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.